Today we're going to discuss the phenomenon that is Codex Creep. What is it, and is it a problem for Warhammer 40K? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics for another more discussion orientated video, today talking about the phenomenon that is Codex Creep. Now I'm sure it's a term that a lot of you are familiar with, but for those who aren't entirely sure exactly what it refers to, it's basically a slang term for the often observed phenomenon of codexes tending to get stronger as more and more codexes come out. It's basically power creep as applies to Warhammer 40k. In general, it means you might have a more effective and powerful army if you happen to be playing an army that's just had a codex released compared with one that had a codex released years ago. It means that books that were released earlier in an edition of Warhammer 40k tend to be weaker than later ones, and I'd argue that the transition from indexes to codexes in 8th edition was kind of an example of codex creep as well. The very basic index rules were basically directly inferior to stronger codex rules that came out giving the factions multiple buffs. It's not true for every single release that Games Workshop comes out with. You can certainly get some very powerful books earlier in the edition, or have the odd codex that really is very underwhelming when it comes out, but over the editions and releases it does tend to be a fairly consistent general trend. For example, in 8th edition 40k, the first few codexes that came out weren't the most overwhelming ever. The Adeptus Mechanicus one in particular was a bit underwhelming even when it came out. It's taken a lot of chapter approved buffs to make them a stronger faction now. Compare that to a fairly mid-edition codex such as Drukhari. That did a pretty enormous amount of the faction going from index to codex, giving them multiple strong options, and most of their units getting into what I'd call a decent and effective sort of range, even if since then the army wasn't amazingly favourably treated by further points and rules changes. Finally, getting towards the end of 8th edition, we of course had the re-release of Codex Space Marines, and all the various supplement books including Iron Hands, which are pretty much some of the strongest codexes in the game at the moment. Again, you can't plot every single codex along this sort of trend, but a lot of them do seem to follow it. So why does the phenomenon of Codex Creep tend to happen? I feel it honestly might be partly by slightly cynical design from Games Workshop, and partly just from genuine rules designers trying to keep up with the latest things that are going on in the meta. I'd add that to a good factor of randomness. Despite playtesting, Games Workshop doesn't always know exactly how strong something is going to be before it gets released. Some of the cleverest options and synergies only really come to light once the entire community has had some time to go over it and put all the combos together in various different ways. In general, with 40k book releases, Games Workshop does prefer to keep things coming steadily rather than drop things all at once, which does mean that there will rarely be a fully level playing field for all factions. I think they do this just to keep engagement with the game, as if they just released all the rules at once at the start of an edition, and then did pretty much nothing with the game for the next few years. I think that they would see a lot of people initially get interested, and then get a bit bored as things don't change. Plus, if they just released everything all in one go, then I think that people will be less likely to pick up multiple different codexes, but when they come out one by one, they might be able to tempt a few more people if they had a bit of a gap in their hobby diary, and a bit more money to spend at any one time. When a codex comes out, there's many things that might draw people to collect the faction, either their lore, any new models that come out, or aesthetic of the old ones. But I think that interesting and powerful rules does certainly draw people to factions. I don't think many people literally only play a faction just because it happens to be the strongest in the game at the moment. But if you think that the models and fluff are sort of cool, then it might well be a deciding factor as to whether or not you actually make the plunge and build the army, as opposed to sticking with the ones that you've got. I think the reverse is also kind of true as well. If Games Workshop comes out with a codex that's really quite underwhelming, and the army that it comes out for is certainly no stronger or maybe even weaker than before, it's going to dissuade a lot of people from picking up that codex. It will make people not want to collect the faction quite as much, and also for existing players, they might just decide that they're not that bothered about playing games with the army for a little bit. Maybe just focus on the painting and modelling for that army, or perhaps play games with other armies in their collection. As Games Workshop does want people to buy as many armies as possible, as they are a company with shareholders, it really does make a lot of sense to them for each codex to have some interesting and powerful improvements compared with the previous. It's not great for the game as a whole though if they make things too overpowered, so I think that's partly where we get the subtle trend of codexes getting very slightly better with each release, but at least most of the time not absolutely blowing all other armies out of the water. So that's Codex Creep, and why I think it's in Games Workshop's interest to keep it happening. But is it that bad of a problem for Warhammer 40k? In 8th and 9th edition in particular, Games Workshop are happy to make changes to rules and points after they come out if they feel if something is either too strong or needs a bit of a shot in the arm to do better, which they can do with points reductions in chapter approved. These can be used to fight against the tide of Codex Creep at least a little bit, making weak units and armies a little bit stronger, and making strong units and armies a little bit weaker. I think Adeptus Mechanicus were quite a good example of this throughout 8th edition. Their original codex did have some interesting options, but it just wasn't really all that strong compared with some of its contemporaries. However, most of the units successfully went down in points repeatedly over the edition, and by the end of it they were looking quite a lot better in 8th, and some of their units were already really quite points efficient even before they got their boosts from Psychic Awakening. Iron Hands on the other hand took quite a lot of flack with various different FAQs, and now while they're still a strong army, they're at least somewhat in line with other Space Marine chapters rather than being way out in front as they were before. I think these do go some way at least to making Codex Creep not as much of an issue as it might have been in previous editions, where basically the codexes came out and then they never changed after that. There are some negatives to Codex Creep, the most obvious being is that the game isn't going to get quite as balanced as if it wasn't a thing. If older books are less likely to win against newer books, then it does mean that that's one extra thing making two armies not quite as balanced as before. It means that quite a lot of factions will be kind of perpetually waiting for updates, whether that's the new Psychic Awakening book or their codex to come out for the new edition, which is the situation that most armies will find themselves in now, and it means they might struggle against armies that have their 9th codexes, assuming the new Necron and Space Marine codexes are fairly strong when they come out. Perpetually shifting armies can also be a little bit punishing to people who are trying to chase the meta and play the competitive game. With the strongest armies changing quite rapidly, it can mean that if you want to play the absolute best thing in 40k, you might have to change army quite frequently, which could get quite expensive. I don't think that really applies to the vast majority of the player base though. I do however think that there are at least some positives for Codex Creep. It does mean that 40k tends to be at least quite varied in what you're playing month on month. If almost every codex is guaranteed to bring some new strong options to the table that are likely to be relevant to the competitive game, it means that the game is going to be in a constant state of flux, and it prevents things from getting too stagnant, and it means that you have to constantly adapt your tactics, which I do quite like. For people who already have an established army for a codex when it comes out as well, a power boost can certainly put some life into some older miniatures, maybe things that you've had for ages that weren't all that strong, and then they can be suddenly a lot more relevant on the table again. I do think in general it does give the game a bit more of a feeling of positivity around new releases too. It means people can actually get a bit more excited for their codex coming out and know that their army is going to get some new and interesting tactical options, rather than new codex just changing things around and not really changing the strength of things very much, which could just feel a little bit pointless having to reshuffle your army for not really much of a different experience. In general, provided Games Workshop manages to keep armies on some sort of equal footing, I feel like a small amount of Codex Creep might actually not be the worst thing for the game as a whole, just because of the change and positivity it tends to create around new releases, provided they manage to shake things up fairly regularly with updates such as chapter approved and FAQs to make sure that there's not too big disparities created. So let me know your thoughts on the issue down in the comments below. I know it's not one of Games Workshop's more popular practices, so I'd be really interested to hear what you guys have to say. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe. We have plenty of 40k tactics related content on the channel, including regular discussion things such as this. Finally, if you have been enjoying my videos, I'd just like to mention that Auspex Tactics has a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description below. If you have been enjoying the videos regularly, then any support is massively appreciated, as it is the thing that allows me to keep these videos coming quite so regularly. Channel patrons get to see a video early each week, there's regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and you also get automatically entered into the Auspex Tactics prize giveaway, where I post out some big kits at the start of each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd like to help support the channel, the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.